Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining us for this webinar series, Reach New Archival Audiences. The title of the first webinar in this series is Create a Community. We are delighted that you are here today all to learn more. Wherever you are, you are welcome. And my name is Emmanuel. I'm your moderator. With me today is our speaker, Margot Note, a seasoned archives expert, consultant, practitioner, and advisor. By the way, a recording of this webinar will also be posted at lucidea.com/archivera/resources. I'll be mentioning that again later near the end of this webinar. And you can also view all our past archival webinar series at lucidea.com. Before we begin, I would like to share what our company is about. Our mission is to redefine how knowledge is shared. More specifically, what we do is we work with museum, archives, and library and other information professionals like you to provide better access and visibility to your collection. And the way we do it is we started focusing on bringing you the best technology and solutions from around the world to create that technical specification you need. We are comprised of a series of products and companies also that have joined Lucidea over the last 30 years. These brands include well-known products such as Sydney, InMagic, Argus, Archivera, Eloquent, and Quadrastar. Well, I'm sure you're looking forward to this educational webinar. So let us get to know a little bit more about our speaker today. We are honored and grateful to have her here on this platform to share her knowledge with you. Margot Note is an author, archivist, and records manager helping individuals and organizations harness their history. As the principal of Margot Note Consulting LLC, she facilitates the understanding of the importance of unique collections, suggesting ways to manage them and use them to tell stories to connect with people. Without further ado, presenting today is none other than our respected speaker and author, Margot Note.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Before we begin, I really want to talk about the openness that we're experiencing now. So I think a very small silver lining of the pandemic is that it's really transformed access. I think before the pandemic, in those pre-COVID days, there were some organizations that were hesitant to put things online or to be more digital, just because they didn't have the means, they didn't have the technical skills, or there was obviously other competing priorities, as there always is with archives. But this pandemic has really transformed access and made it a lot more remote and online, which can benefit us. So, and part of the work that we're doing is also repurposing content because it releases untapped potential. And there's purposes for the archives beyond traditional research. If you think about a traditional archival researcher, it is someone that might have traveled for a length of time. They're in your reading room. They might be someone working on a master's, dissertation, a book, an article, kind of the traditional user that we're thinking about. But with the pandemic making things more open, I also think we should be looking at kind of non-traditional users and how we can reach out to them. And so this webinar series, and particularly this webinar, is talking about how to be open to these new audiences by really creating a community. So the archives acts as a catalyst and a collaborator for these types of projects. Users look to us for our subject matter expertise and our input. By being online and being available and open to people, it also obviously increases online traffic and engagement. And it's really an opportunity to generate new audiences and inspire dialogue, to reach out to these new people that might not have even heard of archives before. This is actually a great opportunity for us to be more open and to welcome in new users. So this webinar series, and what I'll be talking about now, is the 4 C's of reaching these new audiences. It's community, connection, creativity, and communication. And I'll give some examples in these upcoming slides. So community is the basis of really what we want to focus on in this webinar. So some examples are connecting the public and private memories by asking users to talk back to materials. This is important, especially if you have collections that perhaps were gathered from one group about another group, or you're really reaching out to those new audiences, a local audience, a specialists that are interested in your type of archives. So how can you provide opportunities so people can talk back to this archival record? You want to also start to build community with local groups by sharing materials that reflect their history. This is a great time for partnerships, especially when things are online, where you can kind of experiment at low or free or low cost options like a Zoom meeting to partner with another entity that's local to host something. That's a way to share these materials. So let people know in these communities that you are holding materials that they might find of interest. This is something that I'm super excited about that I will definitely be talking about in this webinar, but revealing archival labor by highlighting the work needed to bring collections online. As archivists, we tend to be kind of humble, and we make ourselves small and invisible in many ways. But I think there's a way to talk about our work and connect with people, to connect with community by really revealing the decisions that we make, why we do something the way that we do, why we appraise, why we're preserving things, how we go about our work. And people are actually fascinated by the work that we do once they understand what we do. Another way is to connect with community is to present show and tell of historical materials to share stories and discuss context. So that can depend on the age range of people that you're talking to. It could be elementary school children up to lifelong learners. So what are kind of the historical items that you can show and tell, these interesting things that inspire curiosity about what you hold? And you can document events in their community by soliciting personal accounts and items. We've seen this with COVID-19, where many local historical societies or university archives, college archives, other archival groups really solicited the public to share their COVID pandemic experience. And so this is just one contemporary example of how we can do that. Another way that we can create a community is through connection. So thinking about how to make your archival website more browsable by cross-referencing similar items or collections. So think about your users. They're coming to these collections with either little or no understanding of original order and provenance, the way that we organize things. And these archival principles make total sense for archivists, but someone that's kind of outside of that world, they're looking more for subject or themes. They are perhaps looking, browsing the way that they would at a library. So is there a way, if you have multiple collections in your repository, that you can make these kind of cross-referencing? So if someone is interested in this particular event, this collection with this particular event, do you have similar items across your collections? And how can you more kind of vocalize those connections? You can also host an online crawl with other institutions to share collections. So this, I think, was done more in-person opportunities, but think about how can you do a show and tell or kind of present ways, maybe in a local area, of historical sources that you can share these materials. You can also solicit subject knowledge for records, their context, and uses via social media. So for example, I have a client that has a very rich photographic collection, but a particular subject matter. And the people that are interested in this type of photography are subject matter experts. They're obsessed. So the archivists there have some knowledge of the subject, but their users are the experts. So when they get something wrong, or if they have questions about, what exactly am I looking at, that community can immediately tell them what they're looking at. And so it's really tapping into that knowledge base and understanding, as archivists, we have so much knowledge about our collections, but there might be people that have more particular knowledge of subjects. So how can we welcome the opportunities to get that knowledge and connect that knowledge from the user to us? You can also request comments to capture richer descriptions and links between records. So seeing, how users have used these collections, can they share how they've made these connections? And you can also partner with similar institutions to highlight holdings and relationships, especially for, let's say, prominent people. Their collections might be in multiple repositories. I was just reading this excellent book called Placing Papers, and it was talking about the literary archives market. So how kind of contemporary writers, how they place their materials in archives. And they were particularly talking, using the example of James Baldwin, who has his collections or parts of his writing in multiple repositories. So for example, how can those repositories work together to give a bigger picture of James Baldwin for the researcher, to make that process of connecting those collections easier for a new user? Creativity. This is another subject where I think there's so much possibility for archives that I think we're only beginning to tap into it. So thinking about establishing an artist residencies to create visual performance and literary works. So think about a creative person. They're always looking for inspiration, especially if they're working with something that might have a non-fictional background. So how can you provide materials to spark that creativity and be known as a place for innovation and creativity? So again, taking maybe a step back from that traditional text-based, very academic user, and really being kind of wild and experimental about how you can tap into this creativity. You can also kind of decentralize archival curation by inviting users to build online exhibits. So if you have digital items, how can you open it up so people can start curating these materials in a way that makes sense for them, that they can be creative too in that process? And they can sometimes find those connections that as archivists, we might not be able to do because we're too close to the materials. They might have that creative way of thinking and making connections. And this is kind of interesting by really taking a step back from the text and looking at archives very visually. So encourage users to recontextualize images by hue, lightness, and saturation. So thinking about your image-based archives, how can users, again, use this creatively to get away from that text and look at the more visual aspects of your archives? You can employ crowdsourcing for tagging, rating, reviewing, transcribing, and correcting. It's funny, crowdsourcing seems like an older concept. I feel like it was very popular maybe 10 years ago, but I think, again, as everyone is kind of being more forced online, how can we tap into that knowledge that's there, that subject matter expertise and obsession perhaps of our users, that we can document some of this information? And this next one is kind of taking a page from the museum world. So is there a way that we can provide Creative Commons licenses on select items to make them accessible? Again, we, as archival repositories, we might not have the total kind of rights of all the materials that we have, but for certain things that we do have rights, how can we open those rights even more and allow them to be free and open? So the museum world, and this is, maybe 10 years ago, still up to today, really had a conundrum of, they had beautiful, well-known pieces of artwork, but if you search for it online, you would get kind of ugly looking representations or inaccurate images. And there was also this sense of trying to get the rights to use these images can sometimes just takes a very long time. I know from working as a photo editor for some archival projects, it's just takes a tremendous amount of time, a tremendous amount of money, and it's not necessarily a money maker for a museum. So someone had the good idea in the museum world to just kind of open these up for use. So knowing that, people can use these, let's say, images of paintings freely, that the correct images out there, they're no longer wasting time to try to chase after a little bit of money to get the rights, and you're trusting people to access these materials and to use them in the right way. So again, another way to think about how we can, again, reach new audiences by thinking very openly. Communication. So we can ask users to create illustrative timelines based on their interests and research. So I think with archives, we're so chronologically based that I think that's important to allow people to make their own timelines using tools online to figure out, where these events happen, how they can use your materials to communicate history in a more clear way, perhaps in a more visual way. Based on the data that you have, you can invite researchers to create geospatial projects. This is very exciting when you think about the idea of like Google Maps. I know that, I believe it was New York Public Library that had green books, that digitized the green books, which, as you may know, were manuals that would safely help African Americans travel across the United States during times that in some areas it was not safe to travel. So 40s, 50s, 60s. It was started by a postal carrier who had huge connections. So thinking about if I'm going to New York City by car, so I had the ability to have to travel by car through the highways, let's say Austin, Texas. As an African American of that time, I would look at green books and kind of chart my course, knowing that there's certain motels I could stay at, certain homes that I could find a bed at, safe places to eat, and again, to travel safely. Now that had a very particular meaning at its time for safe travels, but the New York Public Library was able to digitize these materials and then track those places using Google Maps or the equivalent. So users of today could use that technology to track about, what would it look like? So maybe there's places in the tri-state area, there was lots of places to stay at, but as you got further south, there might have been some real long ways to travel in order to travel safely. So it was able to take, in this example, to take a historical moment and really bring it home and allow people to experiment with that history. And it really resonates with people. You can also employ text mining to interpret recurring words, phrases, subjects, and themes. This is important when you think about linguistics or especially literary history to see, if there's a sense of we don't know who the authorship of something is. If we have information and we run it through some type of algorithm, as a researcher, we can see these patterns to see, okay, this is definitely written by that same person, or these patterns show it was written by someone else. So again, some of these ideas are taken from the digital humanities, who are doing a lot of great experimental work in this area. We can reach out to STEM and social sciences groups to repurpose open data sets if we happen to have them, give them the data and have them be creative about what they come up with. And we can partner with groups that use digital image analysis and visualization techniques. So again, taking things, let's say a very text-based documents or a text-based collection, and then working with partners to figure out, to visualize certain aspects of those archives. So again, thinking very broadly and very openly and very with a creative mindset to really attract new audiences to your collections. So I should say, and I feel like I say this in every presentation, it's easy for me to sit here in the webinar and say, you should do this and you should do that. But please keep in mind that, I come from a background before I was doing consulting of being a loan arranger. And I did it for about 10 years. And I was used to making miracles with no staff, no budget, just, cups of coffee and passion. So I know that there's a lot of competing priorities in this type of work. But I would think that of all the ideas that I presented, I'm hoping to generate some new thinking. And even if you take a little piece of what I said, I hope this stays with you. So why worry about new audiences? Why focus on outreach? When it really comes down to it, and this is a truth of archives, and perhaps this is a truth of other fields, but it's definitely the truth of archives, being a good everyday operational archivist is really not going to serve you in the long run, unfortunately. And I've experienced this myself. The way that you can build credibility, get promotions, get your name out there is through projects. That's just how it is. So I think especially newsworthy projects bolster careers. So if you take on, or your team or your department or your organization takes on a archival project that makes sense for you, that you can focus on, having it be noteworthy or getting some buzz around it is going to help not only your archives, but you as a professional. It helps you get your name out there. It gives you a story to tell. It gives you something to put on your resume. It's a way to perhaps to write for the profession, to talk about that project, to present at conferences. It's a really great entree to getting to know people and getting your name out there. This is especially true for projects that have strategic, cultural, and technological challenges. So even a normal project would be helpful, but if you're kind of doing something in a really unique new way, again, that's another layer of getting yourself out there. It definitely benefits you. It's a way for you to advocate for your collections and advocate for yourself too. And it's a way to enrich value in a period of uncertainty, which is certainly what we're living through now. I think on a personal note, what draws me to archival work and what draws me to talking about subjects such as this, like new audiences, is that I'm really passionate for this field, and for us to, frankly, stop being so humble and so quiet about the work that we do, and shout it out from the rooftops, because we're doing really valuable work. But again, it's work that a lot of people don't necessarily understand. So that rolls into the next slide, which is what I'm super excited about. So I think the one way to really start to create a community is to talk about archival labor more broadly and more loudly. So our work is invisible. Collections come to us, we do our magic of processing, and we're appraising things, we're making finding aids, maybe we're digitizing, we're putting out the finding aid, we're doing some outreach, some reference. But when it comes down to it, most people don't know what archivists do. So and this has been my experience, I worked in libraries before I was an archivist my whole life. I never stepped foot in an archives until I was in graduate school in history and actually saw an archives. I didn't know what it was. And think about the average person, if you went to the street and said, what's an archives, or what does an archivist do? They wouldn't know. And certainly, I hope I'm saying things that are obvious, right? What comes down to it also is that decision makers within our organization don't really understand what we do too. They're thinking of kind of the big picture. They're kind of future thinking. They're thinking about budgets and revenues that they need to generate, where we tend to be more detail oriented. We tend to be a little bit more quiet, a little bit more introverted, a little bit more academic and thoughtful. And we're thinking about the past, but also the present and a little bit of the future as well. So we're coming from completely different mindsets. People do not understand the significant amount of education skills and experience that we have. And I think the materials themselves, especially if you have great collections, their creators, so the people that created these collections, and the high profile directors or curators or whoever you have on that leadership team, really put a shadow on archivists. And I think there's ways that we can promote archivists in small and big ways. One example that resonates in my mind is that the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas at Austin. It's an amazing place that they collect mostly literary archives, contemporary literary archives and manuscripts. And I remember going there a few years ago, and they had a small placard on the wall, and I don't even remember what the exact text was, but it gave a shout out to archival labor. It basically said, archivists are the ones that organize these collections. So it was really interesting to me to see that placard, because I certainly understood the work that was being done, but I think the average person stepping foot in the Harry Ransom Center wouldn't necessarily understand the amount of work it takes to process a collection to get it up on the walls. So again, that was a way, and if there's other examples that people have seen in ways that archival labor has been shouted out, I love to hear about it. But that example particularly stood out in my mind is a really nice way to recognize that work in a way that I had never seen before, or frankly since. So there's definitely ways that we can demonstrate our value. We can provide a backstage view of archival work. That this can be done safely if we can in person. It can also be done remotely and online. It can be done through social media. Think about blog posts, social media posts, or videos on, let's say, processing. I remember several years ago looking at Instagram stories of a historical society or some type of archive somewhere. I don't even remember who it was, but they were showing their pest control routines. So they were going through the stacks, looking at all their little pest things, and they were really walking through the process. And that seemed really fascinating. People, an everyday activity that people wouldn't really think about. I thought it gave a really nice kind of peek behind the curtain. It's also a way when we kind of show this backstage labor is discussing our decision-making processes. So why we're deciding to do this versus that. And so people are fascinated by archives if they can see the work being done and then be able to take some of that knowledge and use it for their own personal or family collections. That's how I've tried to talk about our archives in a way that resonates with what people hold dear in their own homes. When we talk about the decision-making processes, we really show that we're vulnerable because we're stepping away from this idea of neutrality, this neutral archives, which is a figment of the imagination. Archives are created by people, and people obviously have their biases. We're not neutral in any sense of the way. We should perhaps conduct our work in a neutral way, an unbiased way. But of course, again, we're human. But when we can talk about our decision-making processes, it allows people in. So again, we're not being so hidden behind the stacks, hidden behind the collections. We're really talking about these decisions that we're making to a non-archival audience and educating people about the work that we do. The one way that I think is to really connect to non-archivists and to reach these new audiences and forge communities is allowing tours of the archives. Now, again, there's safety concerns, there's security concerns. So obviously, I'm not asking you to do anything that is unsafe for you or your patrons, but thinking about ways that you can have some type of open house in a way that's comfortable for you. So it can be in person or remote, and you allow people to visit the stacks. So for example, my local New York City archives group, a kind of professional development group, during National Archives Month in October, this is before COVID, they would have this calendar of all these open houses. So you could visit interesting archives throughout the city to see, have a tour of the archives, look at the stacks, look at what they're organizing, and just getting a visual of the stuff that they have. This was fascinating. I would spend the whole month of October just visiting archives. It was very, very cool. The other thing that really stuck out in my mind is, as far as touring archives, is that Indiana University at Bloomington obviously has a huge archives. It has a very big moving picture archives as well. So every 2 years they have this AV archives boot camp. And so I attended in 2018 or 19. It was totally fascinating. So we saw their warehouse of archival materials. And when I say warehouse, it was a warehouse, a huge climate controlled warehouse on campus or slightly off campus, with cherry pickers that were going up and down, all these materials, all these library books. They had the Kinsey archives, so some wild X-rated stuff down a few aisles, some textile archives. It was absolutely fascinating. I went on the cherry picker up and down. I was screaming my head off like an idiot. It was a lot of fun. And then they also showed us their film archives. So and some of it was being built. So if you think about film archives or storage for archives, it has to be very climate controlled, so almost freezing level. So that was really cool just to see a visual of those materials. Now, as an archivist, I already understood all of these storage needs that they had, but it was really eye-opening for me to actually step foot and experience it. And I imagine if you have donors that you're trying to court to get more money, or people that you're partner in some ways that have a stakeholder in your archives, if there's a way that you can show the breadth and depth of the work that you're doing, the conditions, the amount of materials, how much stuff it takes, all the stuff that goes around processing archives, it really opens up people's minds. And you can have a presentation or have a discussion over lunch about all your archival needs, but when you allow them to step into your world and really experience it, that's something that I think is going to stick in people's minds for a very long time. So again, not everyone can do this depending on what type of archives that you have, but if there's a way that you can have more of an open house feel to your archives to allow people to see some of the work that you're doing, I think that's going to have a huge impact in reaching those new audiences, potentially new donors of materials or of money for your archives. And this suggestion is definitely informed by digital humanities, who that whole sector is doing really interesting work, especially with archives. So again, talking about invisible labor and making it more visual, I think archivists frequently remain undocumented in finding aids. We might have one line saying, this was processed by so-and-so, but we don't really give those credits where they're due. And we're often unsighted in research. If we are mentioned in helping, let's say, someone write a book or to do research for a book, it might be, in that little beginning part of the book that says someone was usually a reference archivist saying, this person helped me find these materials, but it doesn't really talk about any processing that's done. And a lot of authors or researchers don't really even understand the amount of people and labor it takes to make these collections usable for them. So I think we need to, again, taking something from DH and foreground all collaborators' contributions. So thinking about when you have a collection that's been processed, let's say by some interns, someone wrote a finding aid, a team digitized things, is there a way that you can credit people? And this is a zero cost way of promoting people. You put their name there, so they're recognized for their work. It shows all the amount of people that went into this, making this collection accessible to people. It's a way for people, especially archivists that are starting out, that are really starting their careers, it gives them something to put in their portfolio. When an employer is Googling their name, they see, wow, this person was credited here or there. It really is a way to recognize that the work that we do. So make sure to name everyone involved in finding aids and other materials. Really give that shout out. It costs nothing to do so. It takes no effort to do so, but it really has a wild impact. And again, another way that we can take something from the digital humanities and use it to our benefit as archivists. So we should also think about, especially kind of creating these communities, is thinking about active partners outside of our organizations. So archival repositories are not going to be able to compete with the services of community centers. We just don't have the funding, or the extensive outreach efforts provided by libraries, museums, and art centers. For example, if Target is sponsoring Free Fridays at your art museum, that's not going to happen for archives usually, right? So there's a way to find those partnerships that reach out to other places that are doing similar type of work in your community, so that people are aware of the archives and that group as well. So partnerships ensures that the needs of their communities are met. So are there ways that you could actively do some type of partnership with another similar kind of cultural center within your area? Creative Crucibles. So this comes from the NEA's paper that they wrote several years ago called Creative Placemaking. And it's talking about cultural spaces that contribute to a community's cultural and economic well-being. So, we live in a capitalist world where there's fewer and fewer places for people to meet that they're not buying something like a mall, for example. So where are places and how can we as archivists and workers in archives have these creative crucibles to draw people in, to be some type of community center? So there's ways in several projects that we can do this. So we can do archival focused art programs, oral history projects are a way to do that, any type of educational outreach. So depending on where you are, you might be, let's say, university archives. It's a perfect place to do some outreach in that university, both in the undergraduate and graduate programs. How can you do some outreach? And commemorative events. So thinking about anniversaries, milestones, how can you, again, use that opportunity to reach these new communities? We should be thinking about becoming creative. So we want to, and of course, this depends on the type of collections that you have are obviously going to generate the ideas. So I'm being kind of general in this particular slide, but think about how you can connect what I'm saying to your particular collection. So if they rely on specific types of special collections and archives, is there a way to do innovative types of programming? So let's say you have a dance archives. Obviously, is there a way that you connect, a physical dance or a dance program to your particular collections? Educational initiatives, again, reaching out to local communities, your elementary school, middle school, high school. Is there other types of learning opportunities out there? Exhibitions, both physical, like in-person exhibitions and online exhibitions, and interactive archives. Is there a way to make it more interactive, not just, us as archivists pushing out information? Is there a way that we can get that information back as well? How can we make it interactive? There's ever-present challenges. So again, I'm trying to suggest ways that we can do more outreach and really talk to new audiences. But I also understand, that's in the context of the archival realities, which is the ubiquitous budget cuts and staffing cuts that sometimes happen, changing priorities that can be shifting at all times. Logistics, it's easy to say, do this program, but it takes a lot of planning and funding and thinking about how logistically you might be able to do it. And also all different types of priorities of the archives, not just changing priorities, but the priorities that are always ever standing at your archives. So I gave a lot of information, a lot of different suggestions, and I think what it all comes down to is increasing archival visibility. So the visibility of both yourself as an archivist and also your collections in your repository. I definitely think this is a worthwhile venture to at least think about, to experiment with. It's also sometimes an attempt at survival, because think about the archives. People aren't necessarily going to come to us. The people that are familiar with us will come to us, but we have to be the ones that are really proactive in reaching out to these new audiences. So really taking that initiative to reach out to those communities, to forge those connections, to really engage in ways rather than kind of be this passive custodian of the materials, to really be that catalyst and collaborator. So I'm hoping that everything that I presented today will open your mind a little bit about how maybe you can take some of these suggestions and apply it to your work and your collections.
Thank you so much for sharing your insight and knowledge, Margot. I've learned so much about what it takes to create community to reach new archival audiences. There were definitely a lot of information covered today, so we will make sure that this webinar will be available for everyone who wants to watch it again. Before we wrap things up, there are 3 valuable books I'd like to share with you today that you can download now for free at also lucidea.com/archivera/resources. First, The Digital Preservation Without tiers. Readers of this volume will develop an awareness of digital preservation concept, the ability to communicate issues, and a basis for further studies. So if you want to understand more about digital preservation concept, tools, and actions, this is a book for you to download. Second, the archivist advantage, choosing the right collection management system. So this book is for archivists engaging with the process of selecting an archival collections management system for the first time or seeking to replace an existing CMS to address changing needs. If your organization is thinking of switching over to a new CMS, this is a good resource to start so you can make an informed decision when to choose the right CMS for your company. And lastly, demystifying archival projects, 5 essentials for success. Well, this book aims to provide the needed information, just enough project management methodology to bridge that knowledge gap. It's a short, easy read and has a nice flow. If you have an upcoming project you're working on, this will help you with your work and offer you a new way of thinking about your archival project. So we do have a lot of information or resources for you as well. But if you have any more questions, feel free to reach out to either Lucidea or Margot Note. Sometimes we put together this presentation to provide a brief overview of the latest trends in the archival world within the short amount of time we have with you. So don't hesitate to ask more specific questions. If you have research goals, projects, or CMS you are thinking, then we could just be the right person to speak with, right? Well, with that being said, thank you for attending today's webinar on reaching new archival audiences, create a community. Our goal for this series is to help you develop a strategy in order to reach new archival audiences. As I mentioned before, this is the first in the topics related to reach new archival audiences series. So we are happy to have you join us today, and we hope that you find the information helpful and that you will join us again for the next part of the series. Have a great day, everyone, and bye for now.